The rain in Seattle bit like needles against my skin, cold and relentless as it pooled around the base of the headstone. I stood at the edge of the open ground, my knuckles white as I gripped the damp fabric of my umbrella. The air smelled of wet earth and dying lilies. Beside me, the silence of the cemetery was shattered by the sound of shifting fabric and a sharp, dry rasp. Eleanor did not look at me. She leaned in close, her breath ghosting against my ear in the freezing air. "Look at her," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the front row could hear every biting syllable, clutching that pathetic knockoff bag as if she belongs here. She let the words hang, a calculated strike designed to humiliate. I did not turn. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the mahogany casket resting in the mud. Mark was the only one who had ever truly seen me, and he was the only one who mattered. Around us, the mourners shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between my posture and Eleanor's sneer. I felt the steady, rhythmic pulse of the rain hitting the umbrella, a constant, grounding sound that kept me from shattering. This was their ritual. This was their theater of cruelty. But they were playing a game they had already lost. The insult drifted away on the damp wind, but the silence that followed was worse. Tiffany shifted her weight, the gravel crunching under her feet as she moved into my peripheral vision. She did not look at the casket. She looked at me, her eyes tracking the length of my body with a slow, predatory appraisal. A smirk curled the corner of her mouth, an expression of practiced superiority she had perfected over years of social climbing. "Do you hear that, Eleanor?" Tiffany asked, her voice light, airy, and entirely devoid of grief. She is still playing the part of the grieving widow. She turned back toward the front row, her gaze lingering on the mahogany box. "It is a shame, really. Mark was a decent man, but he was nothing more than a meal ticket for her." She let out a soft, mocking laugh that sounded like glass grinding against stone. A Midwestern charity case, lost in a world that never wanted her. I stood motionless. I felt the cold seeping through my shoes, but I did not move. I watched a single raindrop track down the polished wood of the casket. They thought they were stripping me of my dignity, exposing me as a parasite. They were so busy counting the crumbs they thought I had stolen that they never noticed the ground they stood on was already mine. They continued to whisper, their voices a low hum of disdain that barely registered against the backdrop of the falling rain. Tiffany turned back to Eleanor, nodding toward the casket with a look of feigned pity. They were so confident in their assumptions, so certain that I was destitute and desperate. They believed my future ended the moment the lid of the casket was sealed. I slid my right hand into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the hard, smooth surface of a digital key. It was a small, unassuming piece of metal and plastic, yet it held the weight of their entire existence. I felt the sharp edges of the device against my palm, a physical anchor for the truth they were too blinded by arrogance to see. While they tallied my supposed debts and planned my eviction, they remained utterly oblivious to the $28 million trust waiting for my command. That money was not theirs, though they had spent years convincing themselves otherwise. It was a vast, sprawling foundation of wealth that sat entirely under my control. I looked at the back of their heads, seeing the shallow vanity in their posture. They were already spending a fortune I had not yet allowed them to touch. Every word they spoke was a testament to their own coming ruin, and I stood there, holding the absolute proof of their impending collapse. The priest finished his final prayer, his voice swallowed by the relentless downpour. As the mourners began to disperse, Eleanor pivoted on her heel, her movements sharp and deliberate. She did not look at the casket. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were hard, drained of any warmth, reflecting the gray sky above. She stepped into my personal space, the scent of damp earth rising between us. "Do not bother coming back to the estate," she snapped, her words cutting through the air like a blade. I stood still, breathing in the cold, wet atmosphere. She sneered, her chin lifting in a gesture of absolute dismissal. "Your things are already at a shelter. You do not belong in our world, and you certainly do not belong in our home." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, private rasp. "Consider this your final departure. You have nothing left here, and you are no longer welcome to set foot on the property." She did not wait for a response. She turned and began walking toward the waiting line of black cars, leaving me standing alone on the sodden grass. The banishment was official, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who believed they held all the power, unaware that she had just signed the warrant for her own downfall. I remained on the grass, watching the black cars pull away until the sound of their engines faded into the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The silence that followed was heavy, but it no longer felt like a void. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingers finding the hard, square edge of the digital key. It was a small, cold object, but the moment my skin touched it, a surge of clarity cut through the damp, gray gloom. This was not just a piece of hardware. It was the master switch for their entire reality. I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting second, the image of Mark's face flickered in my mind. I did not cry. Grief was a luxury I could no longer afford while they were busy stripping my life apart. My focus sharpened, locking onto the reality that they were walking blindly into a trap they had built for themselves. The walls were already moving. They simply did not know it yet. I stood there, letting the rain soak through my layers, feeling the hum of the digital power in my grip. I was ready for the confrontation. I was ready to watch their world dissolve the moment I turned that key. The morning was over. The reckoning had begun. I walked toward the gate, the mud clinging to my boots. Tiffany was waiting, blocking the narrow path between the headstones. She did not look at me with sympathy. She looked at me with a practiced, hollow pity that barely masked her amusement. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a handful of crumpled bills, and held them out with an exaggerated gesture. "For the bus, dear," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I hear the motels near the industrial district are cheap this time of year. You will need every bit of this to get by." She laughed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the steady patter of the rain. I stopped inches from her. I did not move to take the money. I kept my hands buried deep in my pockets, gripping the edge of the digital key. I looked at her, tilting my head, and offered a thin, calculated smile that did not reach my eyes. "Keep your change," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You are going to need every cent for what comes next." Tiffany blinked, her smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before she shook her head and turned away. Dismissing my words as the rambling of a desperate woman, she walked off toward the waiting cars, laughing with Eleanor, entirely unaware that the ground she stood on had already slipped from her grasp. I remained still, watching them climb into their luxury sedans. The doors slammed with a heavy final thud, cutting off the last of their shrill, mocking laughter. They pulled away in a smooth, synchronized motion, tires splashing through the puddles they thought they owned. I looked down at the gravel beneath my boots, then out across the rolling expanse of the cemetery park. It was a vast, sprawling property, meticulously manicured and worth millions. To everyone here, it was a landmark of their family legacy. To me, it was simply an asset I had secured months ago. I traced the damp patterns on my tablet screen, seeing the legal filings pulse in the dark. The ink was dry, the signatures verified, and the transfer of ownership was absolute. They had spent years whispering about my lack of status while I was quietly buying the soil they walked on. The irony was a physical weight, cold and sharp in my chest. I turned toward the exit, ignoring the damp chill of the wind. Every step I took felt different now, grounded in the knowledge that their entire world was effectively a rental agreement they had already defaulted on. I walked to my car, leaving the graves behind, knowing exactly how short their time in that house was about to become. I found the Volvo 3 blocks down, tucked into a shadowed corner behind a row of hedges. It looked out of place among the lines of polished, high-end sedans that crowded the street. I pressed the remote, the lock clicking with a sharp metallic sound. The engine roared to life on the first turn, a steady, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I adjusted the mirrors, seeing the cemetery gates recede in the glass. The leather of the steering wheel was worn smooth under my palms, a tactile reminder of the life I had curated to remain invisible. As I pulled into traffic, I watched the luxury cars ahead of me, their drivers oblivious to the woman in the older model trailing them. They measured success in chrome and shine. I measured it in the weight of the digital files locked in my bag and the quiet power of being underestimated. The rain intensified, drumming against the windshield, but the heater pulled the chill from the air. I kept my speed steady, matching their pace, savoring the anonymity. They were racing back to a life that had already ceased to belong to them, while I followed, the architect of their impending eviction, content to let the old car carry me toward the end of their reign. The iron gates swung open, revealing the familiar, sprawling drive of the estate. I slowed the engine, letting the car coast toward the main house. From the veranda, the sound of sharp, rhythmic laughter drifted through the damp air. Eleanor and Tiffany were there, settled into the wicker chairs with crystal glasses of sherry in hand. They caught sight of my arrival and leaned forward, their expressions shifting from boredom to immediate, pointed disdain. Tiffany gestured toward my car with a flick of her wrist, her lips curling in a visible sneer. I watched them through the windshield, seeing the way they mimed pulling up to a curb, their voices carrying over the patter of the rain as they mocked the very vehicle I had chosen to use. They were completely insulated in their bubble of entitlement, clinking their glasses together as if toast to their own perceived permanence. They did not look at the driveway as a path of arrival. They looked at it as a stage for their own vanity. I cut the engine, the sudden silence of the grounds amplifying the distance between their arrogance and the reality waiting inside my bag. I sat for a moment, listening to the soft clink of glass against stone, letting their final moment of ignorance play out before I made my move. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air felt heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, cloying fragrance of expensive perfume drifting from the porch. I walked toward the oak door, my pace measured and steady. The laughter on the veranda died away, replaced by the sound of hurried footsteps. Before I reached the threshold, Eleanor moved with surprising speed. Planting herself firmly in the entryway, she lunged forward, her hand outstretched to bar my path. The smell of her perfume was overpowering, a thick, synthetic floral scent that masked the cold dampness of the evening. She stood there, chin tilted, eyes narrowed with a flicker of sudden, sharp irritation. I stopped inches from her, the silence between us stretching, heavy and brittle. I looked directly at her, letting the weight of the moment settle before I spoke. "Move," I said, my voice cutting through the damp air like glass. The word carried no inflection, only the absolute authority of the truth. She recoiled slightly, her hand dropping, and the space between us dissolved. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the foyer, and the final phase of their eviction began. The heavy oak door swung shut behind us, muting the sound of the rain. I walked into the center of the foyer, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor. They trailed behind, already moving toward the living area, their hands reaching for the wedding portraits hanging on the wall. They began to pull them down, their fingers brushing against the frames as they prepared to replace them with images of Mark alone. I stood still, waiting until the silence in the room was absolute. I lifted my wrist, the metallic click of my watch loud in the quiet air. I checked the time, letting the seconds tick away before I turned to face them. "You have 60 minutes, I announced. The words hung in the space between us, stripped of any hesitation or doubt. Eleanor laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that died as quickly as it began. She started to speak, her voice rising in protest, but I did not let her finish. I held their gaze, one by one, watching the arrogance in their eyes flicker. They were still moving through the house as if they belonged there, but the rhythm of their actions had faltered. The house was no longer a stage for their comfort. It had become a countdown. I reached into my bag and pulled out a leather folder, the material smooth and cold against my palms. I held it for a moment, letting the silence grow until the only sound was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Without a word, I moved toward the mahogany table. I dropped the folder onto the polished surface. The sound was a sharp, final crack that echoed through the foyer. The state treasury seal glinted under the chandelier, catching the light like a warning. Eleanor stepped toward the table, her hands twitching at her sides. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the leather before she flipped it open. She began to scan the document, her movements frantic and jagged. I watched her eyes track across the lines of text. The color drained from her face, leaving it pale and rigid. Her breathing hitched, turning into a shallow, ragged rasp. She looked up at me, her mouth opening, but no sound came out. The paper trembled in her grip as the legal reality took hold. She read the deed again, searching for a flaw that did not exist. The house was not hers. It had never been hers. The foundation of her world had just shifted beneath her feet, and the silence in the room was now absolute. I did not give her time to recover. I pulled my tablet from my bag and tapped the screen, the display illuminating the space between us with a harsh, cold blue light. I held it up, turning the device so the bank feed was clearly visible to both of them. $28 million in liquid assets sat on the screen, a precise, undeniable number that rendered their protests irrelevant. Eleanor stared at the digits, her head shaking in a slow, rhythmic denial. She squinted, as if the light itself were a fabrication. Beside her, Tiffany leaned in, her eyes darting across the balance. The smirk she had worn since the cemetery vanished, replaced by a slack, hollow expression. She stepped back, her hand fumbling for support, until it found the edge of the velvet bench. Her knees gave way. She collapsed onto the seat, the breath leaving her lungs in a long, shuddering exhale. She gripped the fabric of the bench, her knuckles white, staring at the floor. The arrogance that had defined their posture for years evaporated, leaving only the sharp, sterile reality of their poverty. They were no longer the masters of this estate. They were strangers in a house they could no longer afford to maintain. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic drumming of rain against the windowpane. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of the numbers settle into the floorboards. I began to pace the foyer, my boots clicking sharply against the marble. I stopped directly in front of Eleanor. "You seem to have forgotten something," I said, my voice steady. "Those monthly allowances you lived on, they were never gifts. They were interest-free loans issued directly from my account." Eleanor stiffened, her jaw set hard. "That is impossible," she snapped, her voice rising in a frantic, thin pitch. "Mark provided for us. It was our right." I pulled a second document from my bag, a thin stack of papers stapled at the corner. I tapped the signature line on the bottom page. "Mark signed these over to me 3 years ago," I continued. "Every cent you spent on your lifestyle, every luxury, every bill it is recorded as debt. You are not the owners of this house. You are my debtors." I watched the blood drain from Eleanor's face a second time. She reached for the documents, her fingers trembling, but I pulled them back. The reality hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were not just broke. They were legally bound to me. I stood over them, waiting for the defense they no longer had. I looked past them toward the heavy oak front doors. 2 men in dark uniforms stood on the threshold, their presence signaling the finality of my decision. I nodded once, a sharp, silent command. The guards stepped into the foyer, their boots firm on the floor. Eleanor spun around, her face twisted in a mask of fury. She lunged toward them, pointing a finger at my chest, shrieking about her status and her rights. The guards did not even look at her. They moved with mechanical efficiency, ignoring the noise as they began to clear the room. I turned my back on the spectacle. I walked away from the shouting, my footsteps echoing in the hallway as the house began to quiet. I reached the study and pushed the door open. The air inside was still, holding the faint, lingering scent of Mark's sandalwood cologne. It was a sharp, grounding aroma that filled the room and calmed my pulse. I locked the door behind me, shutting out the sound of the world they had tried to keep me from. Here, in the heart of the estate, the silence was absolute. I leaned against the mahogany desk, closed my eyes, and finally breathed. The house was mine, and for the first time since the funeral, the weight in my chest began to lift. A soft knock sounded at the door before Arthur entered, his expression grim. He held a leather-bound folder, the pages thick with bank statements and transaction logs. He walked to the desk and laid the file directly over the blotter. "I have finalized the audit," he said, his voice low. "The discrepancies are worse than we anticipated." I opened the folder, scanning the columns of red ink. My eyes locked onto a series of offshore transfers dated during the final weeks of Mark's life. $200,000. Siphoned from the estate funds while he lay dying in the hospital. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. They hadn't just been living off my generosity. They had been actively stealing from the man they claimed to love. Arthur tapped a specific line item with his pen. "It is all here," he confirmed. "The trail is undeniable. This is not just bad debt anymore. It is criminal conversion." I looked up at him, the weight of their betrayal shifting into a weapon I could use against them. The eviction was no longer just about reclaiming my home. It was about holding them accountable for their greed. I closed the folder, stood up, and smoothed my palms over the desk surface. I stepped out of the study and back into the main hall. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale perfume and panic. Eleanor was standing near the grand staircase, her face flushed, shaking a finger at a guard who remained unmoved by her demands. As soon as she saw me, she pivoted, her eyes narrowing into slits. She spat the word like a curse. "Parasite." I stopped, letting the silence stretch between us. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I allowed a small, sharp laugh to escape, a sound of genuine amusement that cut through her frantic shrieking. I walked closer, forcing her to step back toward the wall. "Refined people pay their own bills," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance she had worn like armor for years finally cracked. She looked at the guards, then back at me, realizing the power she once wielded had evaporated completely. Tiffany stood behind her, gripping the railing. Her face drained of color as the reality of their situation settled in the room. They were no longer the masters of this house. They were intruders, and they knew it. The hallway echoed with the frantic sound of zippers and heavy suitcases dragging across marble. Eleanor and Tiffany were moving with erratic, desperate speed, shoving items into bags with no regard for order. I leaned against the doorframe, watching them scramble like thieves in the night. Tiffany paused by the pedestal in the foyer, her fingers curling around the neck of a heavy silver vase. She tried to tuck it into her oversized tote bag, her movements sharp and furtive. I did not move, but my voice stopped her cold. "Put it back," I said. She froze, her knuckles white against the metal. I pulled my phone from my pocket, tapped the screen, and displayed the digital ledger. "That vase was a personal purchase," I stated, walking over to stand inches from her. "The receipt is logged and verified." She hesitated, her eyes darting to the security guards, then back to the cold light of my screen. With a trembling hand, she set the vase back onto the pedestal with a hollow clink. The metal was cold, and the sound was final. I watched them fumble with their luggage, their hands shaking as they realized every single item of value in this house was accounted for. They had nothing left to take. They reached the heavy oak doors, their shadows stretching long across the porch. I followed them out, the cold air biting at my skin, watching them realize the full extent of their displacement. They stood on the gravel driveway, looking for a ride that would never come. I pointed toward the edge of the property where the old Volvo sat, dusty and unassuming under the gray sky. "Since I am feeling generous, take the car," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. "It is the only roof you have left." Eleanor turned, her face a mask of disbelief and lingering resentment. She looked at the car, then at me, her pride warring with the reality of her homelessness. She didn't argue. She couldn't. Tiffany didn't even look back as she moved toward the driver's side, her movements jerky and stiff. They climbed into the vehicle they had mocked just hours before, the metal frame groaning under their weight. As the engine sputtered to life, the last remnants of their status vanished like smoke in the damp air. I stood on the veranda, watching the car pull away down the long, winding drive. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the weight of everything they had lost. The taillights of the Volvo grew smaller, then blinked out behind the thick line of trees at the edge of the estate. I watched until the gravel road was empty and silent once more. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain, but the suffocating pressure that had lived in these halls for years was gone. I turned toward Arthur, who stood a few paces behind me, his briefcase held tightly at his side. He looked at the house, then at me, waiting for the final word. "Finalize the sale," I said. My voice was steady, lacking the tremor of doubt that had colored my thoughts for so long. He nodded, tapping a final confirmation into his tablet. The ownership, the history, the suffocating expectations, it was all being signed away in a series of digital pulses. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, clean and unburdened. I walked toward my own transport, not looking back at the oak doors or the empty foyer. Mark was gone, and the life they had built around his memory was nothing more than a structure of wood and stone. I was ready to move on. The engine turned over and I pulled away, leaving the estate to the dust.